All right, welcome everyone to the forum on Sport Rivalry. I appreciate everyone taking the time to get together and discuss our area of research. I know I'm very excited to hear what everyone's doing, what everyone is, uh, especially what everyone's thinking in their responses to the Q&A and the roundtable questions. So we'll get right into it. As I said, we have scheduled 10 minutes for presentations, and mine is first. So I'll go ahead, share my screen, and then start my presentation. So let me know when everyone can see my presentation, and I'll begin.
Looks good to me. Yeah, I can see it.
Yep, good.
Okay. So this is something, the presentation that I'm going to do is actually something Lamar Reams and I worked on. It's called the Rival Perceptions and Conference Affiliation in the United States Intercollegiate Athletics. And this is something that is going to be, or is in press right now with the Journal of Sport Behavior and should be coming out March of 2016. But it had some pretty interesting findings that I wanted to go over with everyone. So since the Sport Rivalry Fan Perception Scale was validated, we've used it to do a number of things, such as segment out markets, where we found favorite team consumption habits. Even the outcome of the most recent rivalry game can impact rivalry perceptions. Conference realignment, how rivalry perceptions are impacted by teams changing conferences, and we're actually doing something with the University of Memphis now and Western Kentucky University, where we're looking at these new promotional rivalries and promotional titles to promote rivalries, how they impact rival perceptions. We've also looked at the impact of a new program and consumption intentions. Something that is pretty interesting that I know Joe and David will probably see is or relate to is we used the SRFPS to look at rating fan rivalries. And so at this point, we have roughly 2,500 data points. And from that, really what we did is we took an aggregate score of the SRFPS just to sort of tease out some things. And this information is available on sportrivalry.com as well. But one of the first things we looked at was the teams that had the most rival teams or identified the most rivals. And as you can see, three of the teams on this list switched conferences since 2010. Now, the next thing we looked at is which teams were identified as rivals to most other teams. And you can see the top five on here, none of these teams have switched conferences. So it seems as though those ones that have stayed in the same conference maybe have more rival or more teams that consider them as rivals than on the flip side. And then here's the top 10 of what we're calling the most intense fan rivalries according to the SRFPS. And I know David, Joe, and I have talked about Arizona State. That's now three times that people have found that independent people have found that to be the most intense rivalry. So just something I thought was pretty interesting. But what we're doing now, what we'll talk about today is we wanted to look how conference affiliation impacted rival perceptions. And so finding this will help researchers in sport management, psychology, and outside of those two fields. It'll also help practitioners marketing and promoting inside NCAA conferences. So the four specific questions we asked was, will conference affiliation cause fans to significantly differ regarding support of their biggest rival and indirect competition, perceptions of their biggest rivals' academic prestige, assessment of their biggest rivals' fan behavior, and sense of satisfaction they experience when their favorite team defeats their biggest rival. And so what we did to measure this is we posted information. We posted a survey on some some team fan pages, and as you can see, we had over 1,500 participants start the survey. We ended up with 839 usable surveys. Here is the breakdown. You can see obviously heavy Caucasian heavy male. Even, we had roughly almost 85% football fans in this sample. So the instrument that we used in this study to measure fan identification was a sports spectator identification scale. And then the Sport Rivalry fan perception scale was used to look at rival team perceptions in addition to including some demographic questions. And then here are just some of the websites that we targeted for distribution. These were all non-subscription based fan pages. We wanted to give people the opportunity to view this information and participate in this study that maybe didn't belong to a subscription based website. And so our scales that we used were reliable. Alpha ranged from 0.792 to 0.943. And you can see fans regarding outgroup competition or indirect competition, fans were not willing to support their biggest rival in indirect competition. They didn't necessarily believe that the academic prestige of the rival institution was poor, but they felt that the sportsmanship of the rival fans was poor, and they experienced great sense of satisfaction or high sense of satisfaction when their favorite team defeated their rival team. And then here are just the most represented favorite and rival teams. And I included in this table the teams that were over 30 participants in this data set. And as you can see, Auburn, Kansas State, they had a lot of fans respond to these surveys. So to get on to answering the 4 questions we had in mind, we ran a multivariate analysis of covariance. To explain how we got there, first we looked at a MANOVA, and we ran that to determine if differences existed between teams, and significant differences did exist. Instead of using team identification as a covariate or the different teams as a covariate, we actually looked at what were the 2 teams most represented in the sample, because we had some teams that were, as you could see, Auburn, Kansas State had a lot of representation, other teams not so much. And so we ran different ANOVAs on Auburn and Kansas State to determine if those fans had significant differences in their rival perceptions. Auburn fans did, Kansas State fans didn't. So that's how we ended up with the multivariate analysis of covariance to control for the Auburn fans. And so here's what we found, and this is a lot of information, but I'll go over it really briefly. Basically what we saw was fans in the SEC were less supportive of their biggest rival teams in indirect competition than fans in the Big 12 or the Big 10. Fans in the SEC also were significantly more negative toward the academic prestige of their biggest rival institution, and fan behavior of their biggest rival than fans in any other conference. And then the other significant difference, fans in the ACC were significantly more positive regarding their biggest rival's academic prestige than fans in any other conference. No fans or conference affiliation did not impact the strength of satisfaction people experienced. So pretty interesting finding, just to look at these real briefly. Now to move on, some of the implications, future research that we had. First, mention a limitation. We had some fan bases that were obviously more represented than other fan bases. We tried to control for this, but collecting more data in the future may help to give us a different picture or a more robust picture. Some of the implications from our findings, this adds to literature on intercollegiate rivalry, social identity theory, and in-group bias. One really interesting thing we teased out was this question of, does a conference pride phenomenon exist? So you always hear fans in the SEC chanting SEC, SEC, and Big 10, ACC, Big 12 fans, they're all talking about how their conferences are the best in whatever respective sport. Is there something in play here? In doing this research, we kind of found the opposite, that SEC people say that SEC fans support whatever team is from the SEC, regardless. And at least this data didn't necessarily show that in regards to or comparison to other conferences. One other interesting thing to look at is the question, does this say anything about the overall characteristics of people in different regions of the United States? And so this is something that needs much more research and research outside of sport, but it is something interesting that we found from a practitioner perspective. Looking at team and conference officials, this could greatly impact their ability to market and promote their teams and their conferences. Teams such as looking at um, knowing how their fans feel about their biggest rival, and within conferences, if you know how fans feel about a biggest rival, then from a conference perspective, it doesn't really matter if Alabama's playing in a national championship and Auburn fans are watching the game hoping Alabama will lose. Well, it doesn't necessarily matter because the it still goes into TV revenue for the Southeastern Conference. And then some future study that we pointed out, looking at secondary rivals and beyond, second, third, fourth rivals, which I know a few of us have talked about. And then, as I mentioned, looking at this conference pride phenomenon, and is there something else at play there? And is there something we can do in sport and outside of sport to look at that, or the regional characteristics outside of sport to try and answer that question? So that's what we have today. And those were the findings. It was really interesting study that we were able to do. Really interesting, really excited to be able to share it with everyone. So I think we actually have about a minute if anybody has one or two questions, and then we'll move on to the next person. So any questions? All right. Well, then let me go ahead. Vasilis Dalakis is up next. And Vasilis, I will make you presenter, and then you can share your screen and share your presentation. So there you are. Vasilis, you are now presenter. And I didn't mute everyone during my presentation. Was everyone able to hear fine?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
It worked okay.
Then I won't mute from now on.
Give me 1 second here. Can you guys see it okay, what I have?
Yeah, it's good.
Yes.
So what I'm going to chat with you about is some of the work we've been doing at Rivalry, specifically in the context of sponsorship effects. And this is something that I've been looking at for a while. It actually started over 10 years ago with the very first study with a colleague from Northern Kentucky, Aaron Levin, that we did with NASCAR fans, where we found that the strong passion that fans had towards their driver did translate into positive effects regard to the response to sponsorship, but then there was also some negative effects toward the sponsors of rivals. And of course, the motivating factor here is that sports evoke strong, passionate reactions from fans, and as a result of it, you have the companies that are trying to benefit on that. So this has been the overriding theme on research, and there has been plenty of research that supports how the strong identity that fans have towards one team translates into positive effects in regard to sponsors of that team. But to me, it was interesting, when whatever 12, 13 years ago we started looking at that we hadn't never really looked at the other side of that, and this is becoming extremely relevant in the context of sports. And as you can see here, is probably one of the best illustrations with a big rivalry, because what we're having here is obviously the rivalry between the two teams, Barcelona and Real Madrid. But interestingly, in this case, each of them is actually sponsored by an airline too, which one can say there's multiple rivalries. There's brand rivalry and team rivalry. So over the last few years, I've been doing some work with Colleen B. From Oregon State, where we're specifically looking at trying to identify how some of those things are coming to play in regard to the specific rivalry up there in Oregon between Oregon and Oregon State, the so-called Civil War. Colleen, just like I, are Oregon alumni. We both got our PhD there, but interestingly, Colleen is teaching at Oregon State, so that presents some interesting dynamics in regard to understanding the rivalry. The two schools are about, what, like 30 miles away from each other, so relatively close. And the first study we did that was published a couple of years ago, just to give you a bit of a background, was looking at how Oregon State fans responded to hypothetical ads where we manipulated not only the sponsor connection, is it the home team or is it the rival team, but we also manipulate what we called the strength of argument. So we had pre-tested and found that some statements evoke a greater sense of credibility. So this is the example where you see an ad associated with a rival but has strong sense of credibility in terms of the argument. Here is the same ad connected to the rival, but with what we call the fluff, the weak argument. And here is the fluff with the home team, and here is the strong argument with the home team. And what was interesting here is that the fans, the Oregon State fans that were low in identification, across the board, basically they used the argument strength as their most important factor in trying to understand how good this product is and is it worth buying, independent of affiliation with the home team or the rival team. But what we found especially interesting is that totally changes when we look at the high identified fans who essentially are completely ignoring the argument strength and are basically making their assumptions about product quality entirely based on team affiliation, sponsorship affiliation. And to us this was very interesting because it does show something that we kind of, all suspect, that when you're a diehard fan, you're pretty much irrational. But it's interesting to see how this is translating into evaluating brands. So this is a study that kind of started that, and what we're working on right now is some extensions to that. So we're playing off, again, always using Oregon State students as our data pool. Some simple manipulations. One that we're doing right now that I think is interesting. I don't have data to report, but I think you'd appreciate how even subtle differences might have an effect. So here is the connection of a brand with their home team, and here is the connection of the brand with the rival team, which is part of what we're doing in general. But we have introduced two additional scenarios to kind of see are the effects, the positive effect towards the sponsor of our own team and the negative effect towards the sponsor of the rival team, are they going to be accentuated by just switching one word? And I don't know if you can see right off the bat what the one word is. Instead of the Oregon State Beavers, your Oregon State Beavers, and instead of the Oregon Ducks, your Oregon Ducks, because the personalization aspect of it, one would hypothesize, is intensifying the connection and makes the team more salient, which means if it's a team that you already like, you will be more prone to make that connection a part of your evaluation. And it's also a team that you really hate, it will make that hatred more prevalent. So we have about 400 data points in regard to that we're analyzing right now. And the other thing that we're doing that I think is kind of where I see our research in sponsorship and rivalry heading is an extension of the previous one, where again we're manipulating the argument strength. In this case, we're using an actual brand, but one that it's fairly unknown, so there are no preconceived notions coming into play, previous attitudes. But in addition to the manipulation of weak and strong arguments and having the home team and the rival team, one thing that we've noticed is that many companies now can be and are usually sponsoring multiple teams. In some cases, that includes rivals. That's fairly common with college sports in the United States. The Mets and Yankees, and I think they both are sponsored by Pepsi. You see some of the jersey sponsors in European soccer having the same sponsor even though they're rivals, especially across different nations where they play in Champions League. Emirates is a great example of that. So what we're having here that we thought was interesting is the joint sponsorship seems to kind of mediate the negativity towards the rival. So when we have a joint sponsorship, essentially what we're saying is that the ambivalence, the attitude toward the ad, the brand, and the purchase intentions are actually very similar, almost identical to just having the home team, whereas when it's only the rival, we still have all those aspects being accentuated in a negative way. Now, keep in mind, though, one thing here is this is essentially the first study we did there, not including fan identification. We've done another data collection over this fall where we have, again, about close to 400 data where we do measure identification, and we're really anxious to see if that comes into play. Very similar to what we saw with the earlier study is, are the highly identified fans going to look at the joint sponsorship more negatively because of the hatred towards the rival rather than positively because of their love towards their own team? And so in conclusion, part of why we think this is interesting is because, as I mentioned earlier, we see a lot of that tendency of brands to, I don't know how intentionally or consciously they're doing that, but I think they're realizing the danger of sponsorship rivals, so they kind of played the safe way, the neutral way. This is an example from Brazil. In Porto Alegre, one of the most intense rivalries, Grêmio versus Internacional, and what you notice is that the jersey sponsor is the same for both. And in fact, if you go to their website, pretty much the sponsors that each team has are identical to what the other team has. Essentially, no sponsor is quote-unquote brave enough to only sponsor one of the two. And we see some of that even in the United States when we're sponsoring, brands are sponsoring either just a few of the teams, including rivals, or the entire league, and therefore playing it safe. Like what you see here with Tide, we sponsor the NFL, so we connect to your team. You might hate us that we love the rival too, but see, we love your team and we wish everybody good luck. I'm looking at the time and I realize I'm close to being out of time, so I have one implication that I think is interesting here, because usually people ask us that when I present that, and they say, is it therefore meaning that we should not be sponsoring, or because of all the dangers? And to me, a lot of what this has to do relates to who are you as a sponsor and who's your audience, because I think what we're finding consistently with those studies is this is excellent news for local sponsors. If you're a car dealership in Dallas, the Dallas Cowboy fans are going to love you, you're going to reap all those benefits. And yes, there are people in Philadelphia, there are people in New York, there are people in Washington, there are people across America that hate the Cowboys, but let's face it, they wouldn't be going to Dallas to buy a car anyway. So I think it really highlights, in some respects, some opportunities for local sponsors, but it also creates some questions, so to speak, for the national brands as far as how involved they should be in highlighting connection to one team versus others. And I think that kind of sums up where we're going with this, and I'd love to hear some thoughts or feedback either at this point or during the discussion later on.
Yeah, thank you, Vasilis. Does anyone have anything right now? Questions or feedback?
I have a question. How do you define the ambivalence variable you mentioned in the second part of this?
It was basically the level of, I can't remember the exact item, with Colleen has it. I think it was the level of how uncomfortable are you with seeing this connection. It was a level of discomfort in seeing the two together. And I can send you an email with the actual item.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Let me make a note.
Okay, anything else? Great job, Vasilis. Thanks. I will. Yeah. Now, next is David. So, David, I'm going to make you the presenter, and then you can share your screen and start whenever you're ready.
Okay. You see the presentation?
Yep.
Yes.
Excellent. So, first again, thank you for having me and including me on this. What we were looking at, when we first got into studying rivalry, it was just to try to understand it a bit more. And what we'll talk about today are some of these core properties of rivalry that we've uncovered in the research. When we were looking at things, the question that would often come up, or things we'd often see, is this question of, is this a rivalry game? When talking about something. This is seen a lot in demand literature, where if you're doing short-run demand estimation, you have a whole bunch of variables you include to try to measure the attractiveness of a game, and whether the game, or if the game was a rivalry game, that was often seen as one of the variables that was included. And this rivalry game was almost always captured using a binary 1-0 variable. And this approach raises some questions. Can there be more than one rivalry? Is a dichotomous, yes/no measure, is that appropriate, or are there degrees of rivalry? Or does a single score accurately represent the rivalry from both sides of the dyad? So this common question of, is this a rivalry game, I actually think is inherently flawed. And that's because it implies more about the game itself, whereas we think rivalry is best understood by the actors involved. So we'll go through what we did, and most of you are familiar with this, so I'll go through a little quickly in terms of the actual method. But that's, we asked people, said, okay, pick your favorite team and identify the rivals of that team. So you can identify one rival up to 10 rivals, and then allocate 100 rivalry points to those rivals. You could allocate all 100 to one team. You could do 50-50, 60-30-10, however you wanted to allocate those points across the rivals. And then we average those across the fans of a particular team. This getting this measure of fan perceptions. So we did this initially with NCAA college football, FBS level. It's top level of college football. And this is the data a lot of you have seen on NoRivalry.com. So that's the data we already have up there, where we looked at those points, took the averages, and prepared that data. From that, we were able to draw some conclusions, but we wanted to look at it in a few other contexts in order to help the generalizability. So we replicated the study with NFL and NHL fan groups. And so the findings that we talk about, you'll see they apply to all of these groups. So to understand the data that we got back, we use the example of these three schools: Michigan, Ohio State, and Michigan State. So we took the fan responses, let's say of Michigan State fans, averaged how many points across all the Michigan State fans they allocated toward Michigan. And so we see that Michigan State fans allocate about 67 points toward Michigan. Michigan fans allocate about 17 points toward Michigan State. And then we have similar relationships between Michigan and Ohio State, who they're each allocating a certain number of points. And that tends to be a pretty strong one. So out of 100 possible points, Ohio State fans allocate about 91 of them to Michigan. And then there's a few points between the Ohio State and Michigan State, but not very much. So out of this data, as I said, we came up with, or what emerged were these three core properties of rivalry. First one is that a team can have more than one rival. And this means, if we look at that example that we had here, if we're looking at Michigan, Michigan sees Ohio State and Michigan State as rivals. So the team can have more than one rival. Now this is generally accepted among the academic literature. Multiple games are often identified as rivalry games, and teams seen as multiple rivals. Not always, but for the most part. Not for the fans. Some fans view it differently. The vast majority, as we'll see with the data, the vast majority see multiple rivals, but some still say no, there can only be one true rival. Our effort here is to help show that no, fans see multiple rivals, and you can see that in the data here. This is for college football, NFL, and NHL by rival slot. So how many listed only one rival? How many listed two rivals? 3, 4. And what you see is most fans list between 3 and 4 rivals. So for college football, 33% of them listed 3 rivals. And the averages are 3.6, 3.8, and 3.9 for football, hockey, and NFL, respectively, in terms of how many rivals listed. So what that means is, in general, fans perceive there to be 3 to 4 rivals of their favorite team. Now, even if we accept this binary view of rivalry assumes that rivalrous feelings are distributed evenly among all rivals. So you feel the same way toward Ohio State that you do toward Michigan State. And that is not what we found. The binary approach assumes that. Our data challenges that. So the second key property that we came up with is that there are degrees of rivalry among the multiple rival teams. And we can see that here. For example, Michigan feels more strongly, 69 points, toward Ohio State than they do toward Michigan State with only 17 points. And this plays out, again, within the data, where fans do not view all the rivals evenly. And this is by rival position. In general, we'll look at like the NFL. The first rival gets 57 points. The second rival gets 24 points. Third rival gets 14, and so on. If rivalry were really a binary construct, the way it's often been treated, these would be even. It would be, if you listed 4 rivals, you'd have 25, 25, 25, 25. But again, that's not what we saw. And then the third property is that the perception of rivalry is not necessarily symmetrical. What that means, if we look at the Michigan State, Michigan State sees this as a much bigger rivalry than Michigan does. So depending on which side of the dyad you're on, changes how strong you perceive, or can change how strong you perceive the rivalry. So it's not a rivalry game. The way it's typically talked about and discussed, you can't just call the whole thing a rivalry game. You have to look at each side of it. And again, this plays out across the 3 contexts. What we did was we looked at what I call two-sided dyads and looked at the difference in points, how much A gave to B versus B gave to A. And by two-sided dyads, I mean these are rivalries where at least half of both teams' fans put the other team in one of the top 2 positions. So that means both sides tended to see the opposition as one of the top 2 rivals. And even in those situations, there's still about a 20-point gap often between what one side perceives the rivalry versus the other on average. And so these are the 3 properties that really emerge by looking at these point allocations and where people slot their rivalries. And so we hope that going forward, this can inform research so that researchers can more properly conceptualize rivalry and capture it in a way that keeps these in mind. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Joe and talk about some of the industry implications. Actually, I guess Cody will turn it over to Joe. I don't have that much power.
Good. Here, Joe, I'll make you presenter now. There you go. Now you can share your screen and do your thing.
All right. All right. Has everybody got me?
Yeah.
We can see.
We're still. Joe, can you switch it, because right now we're seeing your presenter view.
Yes, I can. Better?
Better. There you go.
All right. Okay. So what I was interested in doing, as most of you know, or all of you know, I do a lot of my work with David, and with him presenting kind of our current project, and because of my background working in college athletics and working for an agency that worked with a lot of professional teams, I always find sort of the connection to industry as an interesting aspect with any of the research that I do, and I know that a lot of you also share that view and even submitted questions for the roundtable that we'll get to that have to do with basically this question. So I was happy when I saw that. that question listed in the roundtable. So essentially what I wanted to do was use my 10 minutes to just look at first across a lot of our articles that we've published on Rivalry so far, what have we claimed to be the industry implications? And then look at a few of the things, a few different examples of what's going on in the industry and how what we've published as being industry implications might relate to those current tactics in the industry, and also what other research questions might come to mind as we look at what industry is doing. So the presentations before me led really well into this, and you'll see some overlap with actually something that Vasilis brought up. I was really interested in that idea of sponsoring both rivals at the same time and using both brands in activation. So to get started, what I did was I looked at about 10 to 12 papers, different papers, and looked at what were listed as the managerial implications. I do a lot of reviewing, and I know most of you or all of you do a lot of reviewing of papers, and having worked in industry, one of my most frustrating aspects is when I get to managerial implications, and usually I feel like the authors just throw in a bunch of obvious stuff that isn't real tactical or specific or groundbreaking, prescriptive for managers to actually use. So I was pleasantly surprised with the papers that I looked at in terms of getting a little bit closer, I think, to what managers could start to use and implement right away on this topic of rivalry. So first we have Kilduff. We're all familiar with his work, looking mostly at rivalry as a motivational tactic, or that was the implication, and he was looking at players in the actual game, but rivalry is not only motivational to players, it's motivational to fans, and that's what a lot of us are interested in the work that we do. So while he's interested in players exerting more effort, I'm more interested in how it motivates fans to engage more with the brand, become more identified, purchase more merchandise, watch more games, socialize with other fans more. So I think there's, from a motivational standpoint, it certainly goes beyond just the players. And then also, and I should mention that many of these implications, I cited sort of the first few times that it came up, and then didn't add additional sites. But a lot of us have been talking about sort of the same sort of implications. So the next one is, in our attempts to sort of measure, does rivalry exist? What's the intensity? What is leading to rivalry? The implications there certainly come up when we think about conference realignment. Cody and what he presented was really interesting and extremely relevant to that. The situation in my own institution, Northern Kentucky, having moved from Division II to Division I, and then just recently switched conferences from the Atlantic Sun to the Horizon League, completely changes all of our sports schedules. So, in terms of trying to build a rivalry or identify who might be a good rival, the research that we do and the methods that we use could inform that, and we've written about that in our papers, not just David and I, but several of you as well. Of course, there's broadcast implications, what games to broadcast, on what networks and at what times, marketing tactics in terms of how much resources to allocate to certain contests when you have limited resources, and what to emphasize in your creative. And then the moderation aspect. So many of you have pointed out that rivalry is not only positive, but can have negative implications. And I think this is where there's a lot of work to still be done in terms of helping managers to actually moderate the situation. And, there's been some sort of anecdotal mention in the research of sort of nonprofit, where the two teams come together, the two fan bases come together to benefit a single nonprofit, or they compete to raise money or blood donations. I think the effects of that, or how that's best structured, is certainly an area for future research. Cody had a very interesting point about, from a managerial standpoint, maybe promoting the consumption of the rival team in indirect competition. So watch parties was something that he mentioned in that article for the rival team against other teams, not just your own team. And then this idea of mocking or not mocking opponents. I think from a managerial standpoint, at least when I was on the practitioner side, we certainly went much more in the direction of mocking opponents and not really worrying too much about the downside to that, with the idea that, hey, this is all in just good fun, and as long as we're not too derogatory, it's okay. But Vasilis, pointed out in that article that, you are given some sort of tacit approval to being negative toward the rival, and it's possible that fans could take that too far, and it lead to some unsportsmanlike or even violent behavior. So it's something that, another area where I think, that research in terms of how best to moderate rivalry or decide when that's necessary could be helpful to managers. And then sponsor activation. And I won't talk much about this because Vasilis did a great job presenting some really interesting work in this regard. But that's another area that there's certainly managerial implications. So then the next thing I did was try to break down kind of how our research can help managers into some different categories. So first would be, that idea of who is the rival. And I mentioned NKU, and a lot of you are familiar with this example with UConn and UCF, where UConn started this rivalry with Central Florida, and then it comes out in the press that Central Florida didn't even know that UConn had started this rivalry. So certainly there's some communication issues there, but I think that's an area where some of our research could help teams come together and administrators come together, managers from the different teams, and decide how best to promote the rivalry once they decide, or if they decide that a rivalry is appropriate. Another great example, and I use some of our own research from NoRivalry.com here as it relates to Nebraska, of course, switching conferences. And what you see here on the right is Nebraska fans allocating their 100 points. And it's important to realize that we collected this research right before they moved into the Big Ten. They knew they were going to move into the Big Ten, but they hadn't yet made the move. And you see that they, apart from Oklahoma, they allocated 21 points to Wisconsin and 9 points to Iowa. And when we look at the other teams and how they allocated points to Nebraska, we see that Colorado fans allocated almost half their points, and as we go down the list, we see that Iowa, they allocated 15 of 100 points to Nebraska, and Wisconsin only reciprocated with 8 points. But it gives at least some initial measure that Nebraska administrators and Big Ten administrators could go with to decide, who might be an appropriate rival, and they have tried to build up some rivalry with Wisconsin with this Freedom Trophy, and also they have the Heroes game with Iowa as well. And this is an interesting example because this could be another way to moderate rivalry somewhat, where you're celebrating heroes from both states in the game. And I'm just going to quickly go through the rest because I know I'm about out of my 10 minutes here. So besides the designation, rivalry series, and I think Cody mentioned that he's been doing some research on series. I think this brings up the question from a managerial standpoint, and I dealt with this question when I was at Miami University. Do we create and brand a rivalry around just a particular game, or do we do it with another school around the series of games? And we decided to go with an all-sports rivalry series, and you see a few other examples here with our primary rival, Ohio University. And you've got the Carlisle Cup as it used to be between Duke and North Carolina. This gets into some of the sponsorship stuff, but the sponsor, as I understand it, sort of left or stopped sponsoring this rivalry, and then Continental Tires stepped in. They changed the whole name of the series. So what kind of issues are there to that? I think some research could really inform some managerial decisions there. Sponsorship I won't talk much about, except to point out that this Audi example in the top corner, is similar to what Vasilis was talking about in the Brazilian context, only this is in El Clasico context, where they sponsor both teams and they do joint activation. So they show both brands simultaneous and very much tout the fact that they're a sponsor of both teams. A sponsorship, it seems commonplace now, and we've already saw a bunch of examples of it, but I just want to bring up, having worked at Ohio State in their athletic department, that, it hasn't always been this way. Ohio State and Michigan collaboratively sold the sponsorship to their rivalry game to SBC, and 2 days later, they backed out on it, and it was about $250,000 a year for each school over a 2-year deal, but the pushback was too much, and it's interesting how far rivalries come from a sponsorship standpoint. We see the joint activation with Muscle Milk and their UCLA and USC. Here's an Australian example. I think a question that comes up is, why haven't we seen this more in the pro context in North America? Here's I think I said Australia. This is a New Zealand example. And Vasilis gave a Brazilian example as well. But we haven't seen that much of this in North America from the pro standpoint, where two teams get together and brand and then sell the sponsorship to their rivalry at the professional level. And then broadcasting and scheduling, just a few examples of that here, and I won't elaborate anymore because I'm about 2 minutes over my time here. But so that's what I had. Hope it was informative and maybe raised some questions in your mind, and I'd love to discuss it more with anyone who's interested. Thank you.
Thanks, David and Joe. Anyone have anything right now? Then, Johannes, I'll make you presenter, and you can share your screen.
Okay. There you go. Is this working?
There we go.
Okay, well, yeah, thanks, Joe. I think that was very interesting. And, you touched a few aspects of, well, my new research, or our new research, together with Sebastian. We want to look into what we call anger management and, well, the marketing of rivalry. Because over here in Europe, it's actually not just about the positive consequence of rivalry. There are actually a lot of negative consequences, like hate, violence, and aggression. I think what we all know, what you all know, is that rivalry has been described as a double-edged sword with conflicting consequences. We've heard a few of well, both sides here. Well, there's obviously huge fan interest, great viewing figures, great atmosphere in rivalry games. The motivation aspect has been mentioned, high identification, and rival games makes a league more attractive. But then again, on the other hand, there are a lot of negative consequences. We've got a few Schadenfreude experts here on the panel. So you know about that. We've got other, well, immoral behavior like prejudices, derogation, and hate. If you look at the European football context, you will find that security costs have exploded. They're at an all-time high. The police costs for police in Germany to protect the fans during rival games, because opposing camps, they're used to collide and clash. I think in Greece, the whole league play has been suspended following riots around derby games. And obviously, Hakan would probably have a few anecdotes or stories to tell about the rivalry in Turkey, which can also get quite bad-tempered, I believe. So there are actually a lot of, well, negative consequences. And for us, we've had the question we found interesting was whether there is a responsible way to market rivalries. Can they be hyped, or would people go over the top? Would now the promotion and the marketing of rivalries just push the hate? And with this in mind, we were thinking of potential communication strategies to promote rivalries. What is it that managers could do? Is there a certain boundary they cannot cross? It's a very fine line between the positive and the negative consequences, and we'd like to find out where this fine line runs. So this is basically just a first idea I'm going to present, and I'd love to pick your brain about it. If you have some general thoughts, we had a pilot study among fans of Borussia Dortmund and Schalke 04, which is probably the most famous and the most heated rivalry in Germany. It's got all the positive and negative consequences. It's got, well, a great atmosphere, sellout crowd. It's really, really famous, but there's always violence. The fans, they fight in the streets. There's a lot of security, a lot of protection, a lot of hate going on between the two camps. Some is playful, some is probably quite honest or true hate, whatever you like to call it. So we surveyed in an online study 510 fans of either Schalke or Dortmund, and we measured identification. We measured negative emotions just by asking, when I think about the rivalry, I feel hate, anger, or aggression, and positive emotions were measured also verbally. When I think about the rivalry, I feel joy. We also wondered whether the fans find the rivalry amusing, and we also measured the respect, whether somebody respected the rival's team, club, or the fans. So just very briefly, the correlations we found that the higher the identification, the more negative emotion a fan would feel. So that's point 20 here. And also the higher the identification, the less amusing he would find the rivalry. So he doesn't really take it in a humorous way. He thinks this is really serious for us. What got us to, well, focus on the respect were the correlations. Obviously, respect is a key issue in sport, and you know, FIFA, UEFA, they all promote respect among opponents. So we were wondering, how is respect linked to the constructs here, and we see that the bigger the respect, the less people feel negative emotions, the more positive emotions they have, and also, and this might be interesting, the more amusing they find the rivalry. So obviously respect could be a crucial, well, moderator or a crucial construct generally in the rivalry research, especially the respect toward the rival. And that's where I'd like to hear your opinion. What communication strategies could be employed to promote, on the one hand, the anticipation, the joy, or the good things about a derby or rival game, but also maintain the respect and make sure everything goes off in good spirits? Is there something like good versus bad animosity? It's sort of a love-hate relationship, and for a lot of fans, the hate is part of the game, but where does this fine line run? And how could it be measured? What actually drives respect between rivals, and you know, what other relevant constructs could be measured in this context? You know, on the one hand, maybe the entertainment value, or how could this ambivalence somehow be measured? Is it entertainment value of a derby? Is it the intensity, or are there other constructs like respect, tolerance, sympathy? I don't know, Schadenfreude. All this would be something, yeah, I'd just be interested to hear your opinion on. So,
Johannes, you mind going back to the correlation matrix?
yeah, there you go.
So you have, if I'm reading this right, there's a negative 0.01 correlation between identified and respect.
Yeah.
So basically none, right?
Significant.
Yeah. So that was interesting to me, that the more identified, there's not a negative one, you know, which supports what you guys found with your, you know, your table study where you had people put table. You would expect, oh, it'd be really negative. I don't respect the opponent. But what we see is that it's not. It's pretty neutral, right? And Cody, this, you know, what you see with your scale in terms of how people perceive the opponent as well. That this correlation here between identity and respect could be surprising to those who see the rival as somebody who's hated. Is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah, I think so. I think. Oh, yeah, Cody, please.
no, go ahead, Johannes. I'll let you go first.
Well, I guess we have to look into, or obviously the next step would be to look into respect. You know, what constitute this construct. You know, what are the drivers of respect? And I believe the level of, well, of tolerance, whether you think the opponent is somewhat similar to you, uh, this may play a role. Also, it's maybe an individual variable that, you know, just whether you respect somebody or not plays a role. So yeah, that's obviously quite an interesting correlation, non-correlation.
Yeah, that was an interesting observation, David. And the way that we always measure whether it's respect or prestige or whatever is that academic prestige, and then we've started using the scale with professional sport, and so we've instead of asking about academic prestige, we talk about the prestige of the city or region or the team, and that subscale is typically the lowest um, subscale or the one that people are most positive toward or disagree most with. So that that seems like that would back up what you're saying. That's very interesting.
So can we draw the conclusion that if we're trying to quantify rivalry, respect is not a term we would want to use to try to quantify a rivalry? Is that right? Because Cody, you're saying it's the smallest in your scale. It's the smallest thing, it's smallest influence. Is that right?
Typically, which that's there are some questions with my scale. There's some questions as to do people really what do they know about the academic prestige, and then even what do they know at the professional level? What do they know about the city or something like that? So I would say it needs more research. I guess especially from on my end before I could go that far. But it is I can see where you're coming from.
Sorry,
I think
Johannes. I know you had other stuff, but that one just jumped out at me as something that was pretty interesting when you were going through.
Yeah, that was extremely interesting. Does anyone else? I had a few things Johannes said he wanted to ask about, a few things I wanted to respond to. But before I do that, does anyone else have anything, questions, or anything else?
Cody, I have a comment, if it's okay.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Johannes, for the presentation. And I think identification with the sport might be an interesting variable to analyze the relationship between the respect and team identification. Because if the fan is strongly tied with the sport itself, that respect might be strengthened, and that relationship, that unsignificant relationship, might be the outcome of this moderating effect, in my opinion.
Okay, yep, something to look into, definitely.
Because if you like this, if you really like the sport, I mean, you know the value of having a real rival against your team, because that makes the sport itself more amusing for you. So that's all I want to say for now.
Anyone else?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's go ahead and we can move on to the roundtable. I'll communicate with Johannes offline so we can move on.
Sure, most certainly.
Does before we move on, does anyone need a quick break? If not, we'll just move straight into the roundtable.
I'm
Okay.
good. Thanks, Cody.
Okay. Then we'll go ahead and hopefully everyone has the roundtable discussion questions. I'll go ahead just to make this a little easier. I'll go ahead and read through them, but then if it's a question that you sent in that you submitted, please feel free to explain or expand upon it. So I tried to break all the questions down into 4 main areas, and we came up with rivalry, context, consequences of rivalry, the methodology, and then sort of the future research into the study. So the first question under rivalry context, and Hawkins sent this in. I thought this is a great question and combined it with what some of the things Joe said. There are sport rivalries arising from existing social categorizations resulting from prior existing political, ethnic, religious animosities. On the contrary, there are also other sport rivalries creating adversary social categorizations on its own without any underlying history apart from the sport competition. So, how relevant is the context when studying rivalry? And then,
That is a good question.
did someone? And I'll go ahead and read the other 3, and then we can just open it up, and people can answer all 4 if they want. Does context differentiate the motivations, attitudes, involvement, and consumption of sport and groups? What kind of research ideas can be pursued to better understand fandom in these regards? And then how can we best test or measure the differences in rivalry between sporting context in a meaningful way? So I'll open it up to everyone for feedback.
I think that's a really interesting question, and there is clearly a fact. One thing that comes to my mind as I was looking at that, thinking of that, is that I think rivalries that are sport related, that are an extension of a broader rivalry, might be important in the sense that they're drawing people in that otherwise wouldn't be drawn to the sport. Like the people who are the fans are following the sport and are following the rivalry. It might be more intensified to them because it's also connected to something else, ethnic, religious, etc. But you may also have people now that become part of this specific game or activity just because it's another opportunity for them to express their hatred for somebody that they feel rivals with, even though that rivalry is not sport related. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that it definitely has the potential of creating a lot of the things that many of you said that I think are very important are all those negative consequences with violence, aggression, and in my mind, without ever testing that, I would imagine those kind of games where the rivalry is more than just a sport rivalry, but it includes all those, have the potential for a lot more of those negative consequences to emerge. That would be my guess on that. And then I don't know how we deal with that or we solve it, but it definitely brings additional dirty laundry, so to speak, in the equation.
So Vasilis, you thinking of, like, should we be trying to operationalize rivalry outside of sport and include it in the measures of rivalry in sport?
I did not think of that, but that might be an interesting, I mean, I don't know if it's rivalry or animosity, and there is stuff in consumer behavior especially with country of origin effects, where they looked at animosity there. So there may be some opportunity to kind of see to what extent, those two are related and how can they be weeded out. Because I do think the sports fan will feel some of this other animosity as well, because they are of that ethnic background, of that religion, of that political affiliation as well. But are we drawing in other people here that they're just looking at this as an opportunity? And to me, part of what I'm thinking that, and I think, I've had this conversation with you and Joe in the past, is thinking, back in Greece where I grew up, where you have the clubs competing at multiple sports. So the big rivalry is in soccer, right? And maybe basketball. But there would be people stabbing each other before a women's volleyball game because their two teams were playing each other. And obviously none of those people care about volleyball, right? So they weren't there because of the volleyball. They were there because they hated the other fans, and this was just an opportunity for them where they could express that. So in some respects, to me, I think that this is kind of like the same thing. You know, there's hatred, us versus them, for whatever reasons, and here's an opportunity where us versus them is manifesting itself. So let's go be part of that and engage in behaviors that are clearly antisocial and dangerous. So
Yeah,
I think what you're saying is a good suggestion.
I think it's maybe it makes me think about the idea of kind of cultural similarity and cultural difference as we described it, and then in Cody's scale, he has kind of some measures of something similar in that regard, and I think that that's an area where certainly we could get more descriptive in our measures or more detailed in our measures, of that similarity and difference. Like our hypothesis, and Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, but our hypothesis is that rivalry would be greater when there's a vast cultural difference or when there's vast similarity, and where it's not a factor is where the cultures are a little bit similar but a little bit different. I need a whiteboard. I can draw a graph.
Optimal distinctiveness stuff, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think, up until now, we've just measured, and we haven't analyzed this data yet, but we just measured cultural difference and cultural similarity as kind of a one-item, measure, a global single measure, if you will, where we describe the term and then we just ask the fan, how similar are the cultures of the teams or the team's environment. And some of what Cody's done in terms of asking about academic institutions or, regions might get into a little bit more depth there. And then there's just one other comment I want to make, because this comes up in my class a lot. I actually teach a rivalry class with undergrads, and one of the things that I'm trying to get them to understand is social identification, right? And we talk about a question that I bring up in class that sparks some of the biggest discussion is, why is there this problem of violence around rivalry in other parts of the world, but not really in North America? And what I'm trying to lead them into, and where the discussion eventually gets to, is, well, in other parts of the world, just like Vasilis is describing, like the team is connected to the political party, the religion, all of these other points of attachment or points of identification. So if somebody insults the Cincinnati Reds, yeah, that's insulting my baseball team, but it's not insulting my religion or my family or my ethnicity, because the Reds aren't attached to a religion or a political party or an ethnicity, right? But that's different in other parts of the world. So I think, as we think about this, and this is a great question, as we think about how we could attack this as researchers, I think part of it is thinking about the different points of identification globally, and then what role does sports play into that, and how is there overlap between sports and politics, religion, ethnicity in terms of identification, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's anyone else? So, Lamar,
Yeah.
are you there? Okay. Here we go. So, anyone else on that topic? I'm sorry, my screen was it was acting up a little bit.
My underlying motivation with this question actually arises one of my research, prior research, and as Joe mentioned, we were analyzing the social identification in fandom, and we analyze the differences between the fans who identify a rival team and the fans who identify no competitor as a rival to themselves. And we couldn't find any significant differences in terms of the mean value of identification with the team or the average attendance intentions between the rival fans and non-rivalry fans. But the behavior is mainly explained by the social identification in the rivalry group, but the personal identification is the significant predictor of behavior in non-rivalry group. And we conducted this research in Turkey, as Johannes mentioned earlier. There is a very high level of rivalry between soccer teams in Turkish league, and it's like a live or die matter for the fans. But there is no underlying history about religious conflicts, about political conflicts between the people. But it's a very long-term relationship between the teams, especially the biggest teams located in the same city, in Istanbul. And the fandom has turned into a very important social categorization in Turkish football because of this long-lived rivalries. And I think it's a very interesting context to test social identity theory because, you know, in North American context, the fandom is mostly tied with the entertainment value and other stuff, but I think there are very big cultural differences, but also between Turkish fans, apparently, it's not only culture, because the individual motivations, the individual characteristics are also important. And with that regard, I think we should focusing on the subjective evaluation of rivalry might help us in the future. And I have some concerns about the concept, about the word of rival or rivalry, because when you ask a question to the fans which contains the word of rival or rivalry, I think many of the people have very different perceptions about this concept. So maybe measuring rivalry or trying to measure it, not using rivalry as a concept in the items might be more reliable in terms of those ideas, but we'll see what the future holds. And these are the things that I want to say for now.
So with these things, and rivalry being something beyond just the sport itself, one thing with some of these situations is rivalries. I'm sorry. How much is sport serving as a proxy for something else? Talk about my class with the USA versus USSR during the Cold War. Is capitalism better than communism? Well, we don't know. We can't say. There's no easy way to define that, but we can look at our sport teams. So if our sport team's better, that must be a sign that our political ideology is better. And maybe if we can get at how much the people see sport as a proxy, I don't know how to do that, but maybe that's the way to see what the influence of these outside, or of existing, as you said, political, ethnic, religious animosity. Yeah, I don't have a good answer, just an idea in my head.
And actually, along the lines of what you just said, David, I think that's where the World Cup, the Olympics are interesting, because the sport rivalry and the country rivalry are happening simultaneously. So when there is the USSR game, it really is more than just a hockey game. It really is about country versus country. So I think that part is interesting. A couple of thoughts that I had as I was hearing you guys sharing. One to me that I think is interesting is I do remember again, back growing up in Greece, young, that we have Greek teams competing in Champions League or things like that, where they would play against a team from a country where you would think there would be more like animosity on a country level. And one thing that I remember that I found always very interesting is you would think that no matter what your own team is in the Greek league, once there is a team that plays in the European League, the whole country would rally around it and root for it because it makes us all look good. But it wasn't like that. In fact, people were taking great joy in seeing their rival team going to England, Germany, and lose 4-0, 5-0. And even making more interesting is when they would play against a team from a country where there would be more of a tension, they would still root for the other country's team because their hatred towards their rival essentially superseded their love for their country, so to speak, which I think is interesting. So that was one thought. The other thought, because we talked a little bit about how we don't see much of that in North America, and that has crossed my mind in more than one occasions, because I do think we do have conflicting social identities here. The teams themselves are obviously doing a pretty good job about not being very political or religious, etc. But you might have owners that have a strong attachment. I mean, right now we know Tom Brady and his connection with Trump. So I do wonder, to what extent there might be a little bit of that. And what comes to mind here is a few months not long ago when Kurt Schilling posted several politically charged tweets. And I specifically reached out to friends I have in Boston and relatives I have in Boston that I knew politically they were disagreeing with that. And I said, okay, now I want to hear what you're thinking, because he is your hero. You love him, the 2004 World Series, the bloody sock and everything, and now she's saying things that I know they're clearly not matching you. So what's happening? And it was very interesting to me how they were disconnecting the two. Like in no way did it make Schilling look any less exciting to them or less meaningful or less of a hero. They just say, well, everybody says, not smart things now and then. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. So I think that to me was quite interesting. Obviously, it was a very basic, unscientific study, but I think there might be something here when there are personalities in sports teams that have a very clear political, religious, or otherwise identity, and how the fans now are either reinforcing their love for that team because now they have extra reasons to connect with them because they're also views of the team or the athlete, or there might be the conflict, and the flip side of that is how is that translating from a rivalry standpoint. Like, we knew we already hated that team from a sports standpoint, but now that we know they're rooting for the other party or religion or whatever it is, now we have even more of a reason to hate them, which will, I think, make it an interesting context to study here. And yes, it's not as clear in North America as it is elsewhere, but that might be one way where we can start looking at it and see how is that playing out.
Yeah, Vasilis, I'm sure your friends would have felt the same way if it had been Derek Jeter who made those comments. Oh no, that's just one-off thing.
Well, and going off of that, Vasilis and David, that sounds like linguistic intergroup bias almost. That, but Kurt Schilling says it, and I'm a Red Sox fan, and maybe I don't agree with what he's saying, so I'll say, okay, he has his own opinions. It's okay. But if I'm a New York Yankees fan, then maybe I start to think, yeah, that's, he stands for, or he represents the Red Sox. He represents Red Sox fans. And so they all share the same political outlook that he does, especially if I disagree with that outlook. Now, what's interesting is if I'm a Yankees fan, Kurt Schilling said that, I actually agree with him. Then how do I maintain agreeing with him but not wanting to show some type of support for Red Sox or Red Sox fans? It's just an interesting observation I heard coming out of that conversation. So,
I also like, Vasilis, your comment tied with Cody, your research that you just presented on, think about like the SEC thing. That's the same thing that Vasilis was talking about with the Greek teams going to play.
Yeah.
There's different layers.
Yeah, definitely. Anything else on this this research, or I'm sorry, this roundtable question?
You know, if I could just say one quick thing, because I think it's really relevant here when we're talking about context, is this question is one reason that I think it's important for us to have forums like this or connect a lot at conferences, because we could address this question best, I think, by all of us sort of working to include each other's measures or parts of each other's measures in the research that we take, because then, you know, if Johannes and Sebastian are doing research in Bundesliga or wherever they're doing research, and you know I'm doing research in the NBA, and Cody's doing research in college sports, and Lamar's doing it wherever, you know, then if we have some common measures, then we can start to compare across our different samples and different contexts to see more accurately, oh, what did you find here versus what, you know, we found in another context, you know. So this is where I think some collaboration amongst all of us, and my feeling is that we're all interested in that. And I know some of us, you know, we've incorporated a few items from Johannes and Cody into our most recent measure that David and I use. But I think that's perhaps one of the best ways to address this question and maybe a few of the other questions. So just want to point that out.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think quite simply asking fans as well in a survey context, you know, what they believe are the factors that have contributed historically to the rivalries that they're identifying. So, you know, is it because of location or some type of political or religious affiliation? I think it would be important to ask the respondents that so that we could tease that out, and that'll provide some additional context. I know that, you know, in research that Cody and I have done, as well as in research that Juan has done, you know, the results indicate that many fans are not willing to, you know, commit acts of aggression against players or against, you know, coaches of an opposing rival team. I'm not quite sure how fans here in the United States have been able to really control their anger and their willingness to engage in those acts. However, I do think that there are varying contexts that exist in the sport setting here in the United States that we could examine a lot more closely. For example, you know, having lived in Illinois for many years, I can tell you that at least demographically, the fans of the Cubs are quite different than the fans of the White Sox. And, you know, the fans of each team are very willing and open to discuss, you know, the groups of fans and how they differ, you know, from one another. You know, whether that's from an SES perspective, you know, race, a variety of different factors. So I think that this certainly provides some insight into, you know, the context in which we can begin to move forward and study rivalry. As Joe mentioned, I really do think kind of combining components and elements of varying scales and approaches to examine, you know, rivalry moving forward will be beneficial for all of us.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
And Hakan, you made a point. You questioned whether we should be asking rivalry and about using the word rivalry as opposed to its underlying components. I don't feel confident in breaking out those underlying components yet in terms of being able to capture this idea of rivalry. I think using rivalry specifically because people have different perspectives of what is a rival or how a rival is constructed, I don't have a problem using that word in surveys to fans. You know what I mean? I think it's important. I think it allows the fan to define it in however he or she best views it.
I would agree with you, David.
Yeah, I would agree for most of the time, but my point is sometimes you put competition between the teams for the evaluation of the fan as a rivalry, and the respondent can take it as it is and just can give you answers, but is it really a rivalry in that respondent's mind? Sometimes it's it depends on the context and the teams and so on. But what I'm trying to say is that if it's a rivalry, it is similar to the differentiation between the outgroups and the dissociative outgroups. I mean, there are some outgroups, but there are some more salient and significant others. So when you just let the respondent answer a question which is worded as a rivalry, the respondent doesn't think a lot of things about it, and although it is not a rivalry for himself or herself originally, they just answer the question, but I think we should be more cautious, maybe. That was my idea.
Well, just a comment. I think this depends on the specific terms that are available in each language we do our research in. Maybe in the Turkish language, the differentiation between the word rival and competitor is less clear than it is in English or in German, maybe. Because I don't have the impression that when we ask a German fan, what is your biggest rival, that there's some confusion with regard to the differences to what are the competitors of your team. So maybe this is a problem with the Turkish language, that the differentiation is not as clear as in other languages, maybe.
Actually, in Turkish, the word matching the rivalry concept is very strong. You can only have one.
Okay.
In Turkish context. Maybe two, but not more. So it's really important to label someone or some group as a rival.
I think this is an excellent topic. I think in an attempt to move on and get through the rest of the roundtable, I think this is something we should all continue discussing offline, because I think this is something very important for the future of our research. So let me move on to the next set of questions: consequences of rivalry. And again, I'll read them all, and then people can answer. Rivalry comes along with positive and negative consequences. How could the ambivalence of rivalry be captured and measured? How can we measure bad animosity leading to violence versus good animosity fueling demand? And then what can marketing managers do to promote and or dampen rivalries in the short and long term? So I'll open it up to the panel. Well, I think if I'll go ahead and start then. I think to answer that last question, what can marketing managers do to promote and dampen rivalries? What we're working on right now with the University of Memphis and Western Kentucky University is looking at the impact of a rivalry title and a rivalry logo on rival perceptions, and then fan animosity toward their rival teams. So fans are presented with three different, or they're presented with one of three logos and titles, and one logo contains the word friendly in it, one logo contains the word rivalry, and one logo contains the word hate in it. And then we're asking people to, once you've seen those logos and seen those titles, and when you read about that, we provide a little text where they can read about the games and the relationship using those words. How much does that impact your perceptions? And Craig just sent in a chat to all of us that I think is extremely interesting, because it says 100 miles of hate. And when we were doing this, we measured these words and what was the most negative, what was the most positive, and the word hate came to be the most negative. So we're not affiliated with the athletic departments. I want to put that out there, make sure everyone understands. But for hate, we ended up coming up with Memphis. Their rival school was Cincinnati, and so we measured the mileage between those, and we said I think it was 400, 500 miles of hate or something. With Western Kentucky, they chose Middle Tennessee State, and it was like 108 miles or something. And so we said 108 miles of hate, and then Rick Grieve at Western Kentucky, who I'm working on the project with, emailed me during the football season and said, just thought you should know that the Western Kentucky football team is referring to this rivalry as 100 miles of hate. So just something I thought was pretty interesting that Craig put out there. But, I think one way that people can promote responsibly is something Joe, he showed the logos of the University of Nebraska. I think they've done a really good job. They're obviously starting new rivalries because they've switched conferences. So when they joined the Big Ten made the decision that Nebraska and Iowa was going to play at the end of the year. The two schools, before they ever played, got together and they created that Heroes game. And a little background on it very briefly is at the end or at halftime of that game, they recognize a person they see as a hero from the state of Nebraska and a hero from the state of Iowa for things outside of sport. And I've been able to go to a couple of those games, and it's a very special experience when they recognize those people at halftime. And then, Nebraska has created a trophy with Wisconsin based around military ties, and does that cause more positive feelings? Because we all can belong to different social groups, and so do we see ourselves as being patriotic, and so therefore we start to dissolve some of that animosity between our sports groups. Now, the last thing I'll say on that is I think it is interesting that of the Nebraska rivalries and the rivalry trophies, the one that seems to be most popular, and maybe this is because it was organic, it was created by fans, but it's called the $5 broken chair trophy between the University of Nebraska and the University of Minnesota, and that was something that was created on Twitter between the University of Minnesota Gophers Twitter account and a faux Pelini Twitter account at Nebraska. And fans got behind it. They created a trophy, and they give that trophy away following the games now. So I think it's a great question, and I'll let others chime in on this.
My thought, actually, as you just said, the Twitter thing is, I think one thing we should definitely be looking at here in terms of this good animosity, bad animosity, and how things might get better or worse is use of social media accounts by the teams themselves and fans, because there are cases, I think it was during either the World Series or the ALCS, that the library in Kansas City and now I forget who were they playing in
Pittsburgh.
Anyway, it was the libraries basically sending messages to each other on Twitter by putting books, stacking them up, and the books, I think it was against Toronto. It was the LCS, the Toronto Library and the Kansas City Library. And it was playful and it was interesting and it was brand relevant. It made the libraries actually look cool and relevant. And I think to me that's a good example when you can be playful, build on the rivalry, use the social media back and forth in a fun way. But it's not easy, and the thing is, at the end of the day, it's just one person sitting behind that computer or that cell phone, and they might think this is funny what they're doing, but it might make things a lot worse. And I think that's definitely something that, as we're looking more into this research-wise, we should incorporate as a context. And I know, Cody, you're doing a lot with that, and we've looked at some of that too with, comments that people are writing. I think it's basically given the power, so to speak, to the people to make things better or make things worse through rivalries. And from a research standpoint, it's something that might be interesting to make more of a focal point for what works and what doesn't work.
when it comes to demand, though, and I think you have this, you could have a compounding factor in terms of the history that exists or does not exist in the rivalry, right? So my concern, if I was at Nebraska, would be if I start a rivalry or if I try to manufacture a rivalry and I'm really focused on reducing animosity, I'm worried that that's going to have a negative effect on demand or excitement, passion around the rivalry. Like if it's too friendly, then it's not a threat, right? And we've all talked about how threat is a big part of rivalry. I'm not really threatened by the other school because they're not a legitimate sort of threat to me. I'm not talking about on the field right now. So I think animosity and the way that I think about it, again, I'm talking from a managerial standpoint right now, but is you want a certain amount of animosity with your rival. Like I have worked a little bit with our athletic department and trying to identify, who might be a good rival in our conference and how they could go about really planting the seeds with fans so that it doesn't look like the marketers came up with this idea, and how can they get the student groups involved and basically, this is being recorded, right? Basically, pull some strings or encourage some use of certain tactics by the fans so that it looks much more organic, like the broken chair. That's a great example of where, yeah, the fans probably get behind that because they see it as authentic, versus, a bunch of marketers that are trying to generate more dollars for these athletic departments, create a trophy and get a big sponsor behind it, and we all celebrate the military. I mean, all right, that's great, but, does that really want to make me go on message boards and, get excited about playing that particular team? I don't know, but I speculate not as much as if there's a little bit more animosity there. That's why I think it's so interesting from a research standpoint, is I feel like it's a continuous scale of animosity, and there's a point on that scale where it's going too far, but there's also a point on that scale from a rivalry or demand standpoint where you haven't gone far enough, because you're missing out on creating additional demand because there's no real animosity there.
Yeah, and that's something that's extremely interesting because we've talked about several times. Lamar and I've talked about time and time again. Is you want some animosity, you want excitement, but where is that line? You mentioned, just kind of the sliding scale, and how do we find that line as researchers, and how do practitioners find that line? And then, but even understanding, if we find that line, then there are other variables that we have to take into consideration that could push somebody over that line. One that comes to mind, alcohol consumption. I mean, if as a practitioner you're getting people very excited about the game, and you're trying to stop short of it being deviant, but then somebody, has too much to drink, well, we have to take that variable into consideration also. And so I think that's something that we definitely need to work on as researchers and help out practitioners.
And this is getting to a bigger issue of event management and how people, do treating visiting fans that alcohol is a big one, overcrowding, heat, trying to think of a few other things. But it's not, we can't put all the blame just on rivalry because there's these other environmental and situational factors that contribute to. But maybe a combination of using, still having enough animosity as long as there's going to be ample space for people at the game. Maybe we can find a balance in there.
Well, that's
Yeah,
where I
question.
think the history
Yeah.
plays into it too, right? Because if you have a history of a rivalry already,
Hmm.
then as a manager, you can maybe play more on how do I reduce animosity? Whereas if you're trying to create a new rivalry, you might need to create a little animosity, but obviously it's a fine line. Go ahead, Johannes. Sorry for interrupting.
Just out of curiosity, in the US, do you think it's a problem that rivalries get too heated and that, you need to play them down a little? Because in Europe, I guess, the teams need to be very careful, what statements the players give before a derby. So is that a problem that people go over the top too quickly, that things escalate around rivalry games, or is it not happening that often?
I don't think it happens very often, and the reason I want to chime in is just because we actually talk about a local example in my class. So the University of Cincinnati and Xavier, both schools in our metro area with Northern Kentucky, are pretty big rivals of each other, and they got in this huge fight on the basketball court, and the game was on national TV. I don't think it happens as much as it does in Europe, but I give that as an example where in my class I have some administrators from UC and from Xavier that happen to be grads of our program come in and talk to the class about, okay, what steps did they take to moderate the rivalry a little bit? And did they overreact? Because some people thought that maybe they overreacted a little bit and it reduced the animosity to a level where, they played at a neutral site and didn't even sell out the game like 2 years later, which was a big surprise, I guess you could say. So I think it is to answer your question, I think, yeah, it is a factor, but less than you see in your context in Europe.
Okay.
I agree. I certainly think it's less than what we observe in Europe. However, I also think we do a great job here in the U.S. of covering it up quite a bit. We may not have as large a scale of aggression and violence that's taking place, but if you were to look at individual rivalry games across levels of sport, from high school on up to the professional level, you'll certainly find quite a few incidents of violence and deviant behavior that takes place among fans. I was talking about this, in my class actually a few weeks ago with some students here that attended local high schools, and they were stating that the football game when they were in high school between their home school and their number one rival on an annual basis led to fighting, to a point where many parents didn't want their children attending and going to the game and so forth. And there was actually discussion of no longer even having the teams compete. Yet it's something obviously that doesn't really make national news or the news outside of just solely the local area. But I think even at the college and professional levels here in the U.S., it certainly takes place. We just do a good job of covering it up. The NFL and fans being booted out of games and having to take the fan conduct course, and lots of wacky things that Cody and I have read about and discussed with fans in our research on rivalries as well at the college level.
And I think part of that, I agree with you, part of why we don't see that being publicized as much in the U.S. is because usually it happens still at a more individual level. So here's a person here and here's a person there, and there might be a small group. Whereas in Europe and South America, you have a much more organized group of people that jointly engage in acts of aggression against another group of people from the other team, which makes it a more dangerous context, but also more importantly, more likely to be covered in the media, because now you're having 50 people here jointly fighting 50 people from there, and thankfully we don't really have that in the U.S. The mass mob violence. I've been at games, and I would argue that every single game, even non-rivalry games, you have disorderly conduct by people in terms of verbal aggression or even physical aggression, but it's usually a one-on-one situation.
Yeah, anything else before we move on? We're right up about 15 minutes left, so we'll try to get to the last two. The next set is methodology. When studying rivalry in a general context, so not team specific, so if you're doing consulting work for a team or something, is it more important or useful for researchers to provide participants with a rival beforehand or allow fans to identify their own? What are some benefits and consequences of each method? And then as researchers, what is the preferred method to use to investigate and understand the rivalry phenomenon, such as quantitative, qualitative, some experimental methods, asking about perceptions and tensions using secondary data. And then lastly, what are ways to conceptualize rivalry beyond social identity and disposition of mirth?
For the first one, I think it depends on what you want to know. Like, is it more useful for researchers to provide participants with rival teams or allow teams to identify their own? We're starting to get a better sense, a quantitative sense of rival teams from the research that of us are doing, where we have a good amount of data to say, all right, typically fans will see this opponent as a rival. If you're going to provide a team, though, in a situation like that, I would like to see a question that checks the respondents' perception of that team as a rival. So if you say, think of a Western Kentucky fan, for example, or think about Western Kentucky, blah, blah, blah. One question before you get to what you really want to know, or at some point in your battery, needs to be, how much do you perceive Western Kentucky to be a rival? If you're going to draw conclusions and say it's a rival, I'd like to have that as a control.
That's a very good point, David.
I think it's important too that kind of along the lines of what David's mentioning, is it depends on the context of the study and what the research questions are. If in a sense, we're attempting to operationalize rivalry and we're just wanting to garner perspectives on a single team, then I think it'd be great to provide the potential rival to the respondents. However, as we've all know, and as David was mentioning earlier, this idea that rivalries aren't always symmetrical, I think it's important that we do, provide respondents with some latitude to be able to, self-identify who those rivals are, so that then we can, gain a better understanding of those relationships.
So, Vasilis, in your study with the Oregon and Oregon State fans, do you have a question like that in there?
Normally don't. We are assuming, the rivalry based on existing non-anecdotal, but we're not measuring that as aggressively. It's definitely something that might be worth including. So I think at this point, for the sake of simplicity of the measures, we haven't looked at them. We're looking mostly at the fan ID with their own school, but not so much. There are some questions that is the reverse of the Ashworth and Mile for the other school kind of thing, like when they're talking about in the story the media criticizes the Oregon Ducks, I feel joy. So there is some element of assuming rivals, so more like proxy measures, but not in a direct sense.
Like you're measuring disidentification.
Essentially, yes.
Right.
For the Oregon State, Oregon State, though, as you said, it's pretty well established they view Oregon as a rival. I don't think you'll get too much argument. And the data, I just pulled up our data on that. They gave 81 points. Oregon State fans gave 81 points to Oregon. Now, that's very high overall. So I don't think you're going to get any argument there. But in terms of the individual fan and how they perceive it, that's where I like seeing.
No, I think that's a valid point. That's a good suggestion, and we should, because we've been fortunate to be able to collect the data there. So there's definitely ways we can, as we're building it, down the year, we can measure perceptions of rivalry from the fans in addition to identification and disidentification. And you're right that in some respect it's definitely not symmetrical. If we do the same thing in Oregon, while there is hatred for Oregon State, it will not be the same. And Colin, actually having been to both schools, he has some interesting anecdotal evidence. He says, Oregon State fans would always root against Oregon no matter what. But with Oregon, and I've been in that boat. If they're playing a non-conference or something like that, I might have, I've rooted for Oregon State on occasion. So it's not as strong, the hatred. But the Oregon State, it is like that. It is kind of like that poor little brother syndrome that Oregon gets all the
Right.
attention, and there is constantly this desire to prove themselves and celebrate every loss. Plus, I think kind of goes this to your rivalry factors. The relative dominance. Our Oregon's two big rivals are Washington and Oregon State, and Oregon has a 12-game win streak against Washington and an 8-game win streak against Oregon State. So I think that's reinforces their hatred towards Oregon even more so. So on a broad level, there's no question that it is a rivalry when we're doing this. But I think you're right that it will be richer if in our data we have the ability to see how each individual comes into play and to what extent this is related to identification. You might be lowly identified with Oregon State and still see Oregon as a big rival that you hate. So there's definitely some opportunity there. I think that's a good suggestion.
Well, and I feel like respect, Johannes's idea of respect could play a big factor in some of the research that you do around sponsorship too, Vasilis, how much, kind of like that idea that you were, not exactly the same, not exactly analogous, but that idea of, some Ohio State fans would root against Michigan no matter what, Other Ohio State fans, I feel like, will root for Michigan in their bowl game because it's good for the Big Ten. Or, we're embarrassed when Michigan lost to Appalachian State. There's a little bit of schadenfreude there, like, aha, you lost to a 1AA team. But at the same time, that reduces the rivalry somewhat, or it reduces the prestige of having Michigan as a rival if they can't even beat a 1AA team, And I think the difficult thing is that different fans have different views on that, Some, and I don't think it's dependent on the rivalry either. Like, I think some Alabama fans would, they have respect for Auburn, a lot of respect for Auburn. Other Alabama fans would like all Auburn fans to burn in hell, Like, that's just differences within the rivalry or within the sample or the fans.
Absolutely.
The schools.
Well, and I would like to add, Joe, you're definitely correct. And when we did Glory Out of Reflective Failure and looked at that was we found that as far as some people want the rival team to be successful because it reflects positively on the conference, and others can't even stand the fact that they're playing in a championship game. I would like to add one thing on that the second question there about the preferred method. I think most of us here are primarily quantitative, but I would like to highlight or point out in better understanding rivalry, I think we need to be aware of the qualitative measures or the qualitative research as well. And in particular, we started this roundtable talking about Hawkins' question and his observation that maybe rivalry means something different in a different context. I think that may be a way to sit down and ask fans, what does rivalry mean to you, and what does this team mean to you? And that might be a way that we could figure out some of that information.
I agree, Cody, especially as it relates to one of the earlier questions that we had regarding context. If we were going to do some exploratory research on examining context of various rivalries, across the globe, then I think that certainly beginning with some qualitative work would help.
So let's go ahead and go on to our last set of questions, and this is the future study in sport rivalry. What are rivalry factors that were not covered in the Tyler and Cobb's 2015 article? And then the second is the SRFPS measures or uses 4 factors of a rivalry to measure fan perceptions of rival teams and was developed with fan input. However, are there other factors that would be beneficial to examine and possibly include in the scale? And then finally, what are some of the future areas of rivalry that need to be studied?
And I'll give some context to the first question since that was mine. we developed those based on kind of what we were talking about, this somewhat qualitative, very, very simplistic qualitative surveying, not depth interviews about rivalry or anything, but asking people what is a rivalry? What does that mean to you? What factors go into the rivalry, and then from that narrowing it down to those 11 that we identified. But well, we had some internationalization of the sample. It certainly wasn't. It was still a convenience sample. It wasn't a representative one or anything. So when you guys, who are all of expertise in rivalry, look at that, do you see glaring omissions or things that we should be looking at going forward? All of us, royal we of if we're looking at these antecedents to rivalry and what makes a rivalry, are there things there that are not included?
Well, one thing I would like to say is that I think we should try to find some agreement on what is rivalry as a theoretical construct itself, what are antecedents, what are consequences. So I think we need some overarching theoretical framework just to make sure that our research is more consistent and it's better comparable. It's something I think Cody or someone else mentioned earlier that we should use each other's measures in our studies. Oh no, it was Joe, I think. And I think this is also important to find some theoretical agreement. What is rivalry? What are the consequences? What are the antecedents? Because in the rivalry perception scale, I think there are several aspects combined. There are aspects that maybe constitute a rivalry, and there are other things that are, in my mind, more effects of rivalry and maybe other correlates of rivalry. So that's one thing I think our field would benefit from trying to be more consistent in defining the variables we use a little bit better.
That's something we struggled with, was that what's an antecedent versus what's an outcome.
Yeah.
One thing and thanks for sending over the list, because it's a rather long list. You guys identified so much. You did such a great job. Something that came up today that made me, is the reason I'm thinking about it, is maybe, an antecedent would be those personal relationships we have with others as well that maybe occur outside of sport. And so, I'm thinking, I've talked to many people, and they say, if your friend is a fan of a team, then in some ways, do you have a positive perception of that team or relationship with that team? Whereas if someone you consider that you don't like, if they're a fan of a team, then do you have some type of negative feelings toward that team? So that might be something to look at.
Well, I think you're right there. Like, one of the scales that we used as an outcome was we adapted from a bias or a discrimination scale. And I think that, while I'm far from being a social psychologist, I think that we all realize that, a lot of the biases or prejudices that we have get reduced when we meet people that are of that persuasion and don't fit that prejudice, right? So I could be really prejudiced against, I don't know, Russians, but then once I get to know a couple Russians, right, the research would suggest that my prejudice or my bias is going to be reduced because of an increase in familiarity. So I think that we could use some of that research in that area to inform that exact question, Cody, which is a really good question, personal relationships with the rival team or rival fan group.
And one thing going off of that, Joe, is at NASM, all of you who saw it, we presented on looking at bias and how visiting the city where your rival team plays, how that impacts your perceptions. And interestingly, in some ways, it decreased the perceptions of the rival team. Some other ways, it increased the negativity, but it also increased the negativity of your favorite team's fans. And so, in particular, we found that if you have visited the rival city for a reason other than a sporting event, you felt that the fans of your favorite team behaved more poorly than if you hadn't visited that city. And so, it's it is sort of putting that into a context that you know who these people are, or you at least know the city outside of the sporting context. And so maybe it even changes your mind a little bit about your in group. So we are
Sorry,
a little over
um,
time, but does anyone else have anything? I think Hakim was trying to talk. I'm sorry.
yeah, I have a short comment. Maybe a factor about the social prominence or social dominance might be interesting about
Okay.
uh, about these three dimensions. I mean, as a uh, as an antecedent, cultural difference and cultural similarity variables can give some idea about that. But if we think about the teams like having a rivalry, but one of the team has a very big fan base in terms of numbers, and the other one has a smaller fan base, and it might be interesting. Or if we think about the European sports, there might be a local rivalry between two teams, but one of the teams might be more successful on the international area, so it might be also an interesting factor, I think.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anything else on any of the other questions or just final comments in general?
Just one final comment is thanks again for actually having the gumption to put this together for something we've been talking about since probably October 2009. That we finally made it happen, and I appreciate your work and initiative on it.
Oh, no problem. I'm so happy everyone was able to get together. And I mean, there are obviously other people out there who are doing some great work in this as well. This is something I want us all to continue and do this annually or at a regular time and hopefully we can grow it to where we can get more and more people involved. And I think that is the way that we will form the future study of sport rivalry. And so I appreciate everyone for participating. And if you were a presenter or if you were part of the roundtable discussion or both, obviously this would not have happened without great input from everybody in here. So if there aren't any other, before I close, are there any other comments people would like to make? All right.
I'd just
Well,
like to echo that sentiment. Sorry, Cody. I'd just like to echo that sentiment and thank everyone for coming in today. It was a pleasure meeting all of you, and it's nice to kind of put a face with a name. I know that it's kind of hard to do, obviously impossible to do when you're just reading manuscripts, and I know several of you have met at conferences and others I have not, but it's great to finally get together and talk with everyone. And good to see you again as well, Johannes. We'll have to talk about some combat sport research sometime soon.
Yeah.
yeah, well, thanks everyone for coming.